Okay, so moving on. Um, let's talk about convenience sampling. So, kind of the other side of the coin from probability sampling is when we're not really considering how representative our sample is. And we kind of touched on this already, but we'll talk a bit more about when that's okay, if it's okay, and what exactly it is. So, convenience sampling is, of course, again, when you're not really trying to be representative of the population. And it typically involves a lot of undergraduates. So, as you're probably aware, Psych 100 students have to do a certain amount of research to get credit for their course. So, um, each lab runs a lot of their studies on undergraduates that are taking intro psych. Now, this is obviously not representative and it's not expected to be because it's a very specific demographic of fairly young, um, probably above average intelligence um, students, probably pretty good socioeconomic status and stuff like that. But there are, of course, and there are other ways in which it differs. So, like I said, most of the research, especially in cognitive psychology, which is my field, um, and social to some degree as well, gets done on these students. Um, there's actually an analysis of papers published in top tier psychology journals, and they found that 67% of US studies and 80% of other studies were done on psychology undergraduates. So a lot of what we publish is based on this kind of narrow demographic of intro psychology students. Now, what I want you to kind of think critically about is this a problem or not? Well, it obviously depends. Um, so first, let's ask, well, how might college students, particularly intro psych students, be different from the general population of adults? So remember, if we're trying to look at some memory phenomenon or something in social psychology or some perception research, we probably want to apply that to a much broader population, maybe just pretty much everyone with a memory or everyone, you know, who interacts socially with others. So pretty broad population, right? Well, college students are probably not actually, or definitely not, I should say, representative of that. So they're going to be a pretty narrow age range, 18 to 24. Um, there's actually more females than males in psychology, as well as college in general. Um, and there's some others too. They tend to be, like I said, pretty high from high income families, um, and many other characteristics. So this is, of course, something to consider when thinking about the generalizability of a result. So if we're running, again, some sort of memory study and we're using a convenient sample of college students or intro psych students, does that tell us, how this might work in the actual population or in others, other other age ranges or um, other demographics? Well, we'll keep thinking about that. Just some other things to consider here is that the demographics of researching when it comes to researching college students has improved. So it's in terms of ethnicity, it's a lot more representative of the population than it was, say, like 40 or so years ago. Um, as you can see here, you don't have to remember these numbers, but just remember that, like I said, the representative of the sample of college students is closer to what it is in the actual population, so more diverse. So that's good. Um, Not so much with other factors. So um, with socioeconomic status, household income, it's it can vary a lot depending on where you test it. So a lot of high-end universities, like say Northwestern University, um, the median household income is way higher than it is for a lot of other places. And this is not random. This kind of compounds with the fact that the higher end school are going to publish more work. Okay, so kind of your typical smaller college or even university is not the professors that are not expected to publish as much as the professors at like high end research schools like Northwestern or Stanford or UCLA and so on and so forth. So with that in mind, we also know again that those higher end schools are going to attract higher um, higher income families than are the lower schools. Um, so the fact that they're publishing more publications are going to come from higher income families than low income families. Because again, higher income families are more likely to go to the higher research institutes or children are rather. So that's where, and again, just kind of reinforce the point, psych students or just university students in general are a convenient sample and they're not representative of the population or most of the time. Looking specifically again at college students in psych courses, there's more women than men. They also have more interest and knowledge of psychology. Um, so those things could presumably or certainly affect your results, right? You could definitely get results that are more specific to those demographics that don't actually generalize to most individuals. Um, and just kind of think about it further, right? If someone has an interest in psychology, how might they differ? And these are kind of questions you always want to ask with recruiting methods. How is it that the sample I drew might differ from the population in question? So how might, say, someone who's interested in psychology be different from your average person? Well, they might be more social. They might be more interested in other people. Um, they might be more aware of others' emotions or something like that. They might be more kind of aware of their own or interested in their own cognitive processes. These are things that all could impact your results, right? Um, let's say just go with the one of maybe they're more social. I don't know if it's true or not, but just as an example, if psychology students are more social than the average person, and then you run a study looking at social interaction, that could very much impact the results, right? Um, so, I mean, is it okay to use convenience samples? Well, as always, it depends, right? Something like memory, I'd say most of the time it's okay. But there are always exceptions, and there's some interesting findings out there looking at how memory can actually differ across cultures. Something like color perception or kind of neural activation. That's more likely to be okay to use college students. Um, it's kind of a it is a biological process. Um, it's not like your rods and cones are different depending on your socioeconomic status or anything like that. Although, if I wanted to just argue the point, I'm pretty sure there is research showing that women are better than men at color discrimination, not like ethnicity color, but like you show people two shades of blue and they're really close but not identical. To men, they look the same. To women, they actually are better at telling the difference. So again, there's always going to be examples where um, things can change depending on who you're testing. Something like attitudes that could very well be quite different depending on who you ask. So you might be getting a very narrow picture or specific picture if you're only asking college students, right? Again, bottom line is just it depends on who your population is and kind of what reason you might have to suspect or not suspect differences depending on who you ask. Um, just one thing I wanted to clear. Um, Oh yeah. Okay, still getting to that. Never mind. Um, so I mean that's always the question, right? Is do and lots of people, I think not enough people talk about this. Again, in cognitive psych, we just run our studies on undergraduates and kind of assume that works for everyone. And I think more research could be done, like looking at how that might be specific to undergraduates. For example, Peterson in 2001 found that college students are more homogeneous, meaning their responses are less variable. So what that just means is when you run a manipulation, um, or rather, you look at, say, I don't know, memory ability in college students, they tend to be, say, more consistent across individuals than they would be in the general population. The general population, they vary a lot more. And this makes it so that the effect sizes, so that how big of an effect the manipulation has, is greater for students than non-students. So again, does that matter? Well, it all depends on your research question. Say I was looking at a memory strategy. So I'll always use the example of taking a practice exam. That's a really good way to study. Well, if the effect size of taking a practice exam, if the difference between taking a practice exam and say rereading your notes is much bigger for college students than for most people, I mean, that could be a problem, right? Maybe if I'm recommending this strategy and saying it's so great, but it's only great and it's only for college students and it's only okay for average people, that could be an issue. That's again something to consider. Just one thing I wanted to clarify from last time. So I talked a bit about, relative comparisons versus kind of getting a descriptive stat and wanting an exact number. This is what I meant by that. So let's say we were looking at the average, or let's say we wanted to look at how cell phones affect us while driving. Now we would want to would we need a representative sample there? Maybe, maybe not. Um, if we're interested in kind of the relative comparison, differences in demographics don't necessarily matter that much. They only matter when they actually change the effect. So let's look at an example. Um, let's say I run an experiment in a driving simulator and I have um, some older adults and some younger adults either drive with a cell phone or drive without a cell phone. That's the control. And I get the difference. Well, one possibility is that, let's say young people, just because they're less experienced drivers, make more mistakes overall. I don't know if that's true. Again, just an example. So they make more mistakes overall, regardless of whether they're using a cell phone or not. That doesn't really matter because what we're interested in is the relative difference. So let's say the older adults make like 10, 9, 7 mistakes with a cell phone, but they only make 5, 4, and 3 without a cell phone. And we get a difference of 5. Maybe the younger adults make 15, 14, and 16, but with a cell phone, but 10, 8, and 11 without a cell phone. Well, the difference is still 5 there. So yeah, so younger adults are making more mistakes overall. So if I wanted an exact number of how many mistakes do people make with cell phones, then I might want a representative sample. But if I'm really just interested in the difference between cell phones and no cell phones, then it might not matter. Might not matter because whether they're older or younger, yes, it's affecting their overall mistakes, whether they have a cell phone or not, but the difference is still the same, right? So whatever their baseline mistakes is without a cell phone, it doesn't really change the main claim of, oh, you're going to make this many more mistakes with a cell phone than without a cell phone, because that's the same. The difference is the same. That's what we mean by when we're looking at a comparison, we might not care so much about the sample being representative. Because if I were to only look at younger adults, the difference is still the same than if it was older adults. One more example, or you might get differences in the size of the effect. This is all like interactions, which I'm not sure if we talk about, but it's good to mention it. Um, you might find that it's a slightly bigger effect for, say, younger adults than older adults, maybe because younger adults like their cell phones more. That also is probably okay. Because yes, it's a bigger effect for younger adults, as you can see here, than older adults, but the difference is still there, and the bottom line of you make many more mistakes with a cell phone doesn't really change. The central takeaway is the same. However, there could be situations where maybe you again do need a representative sample because your findings only apply to a specific part of that sample. So let's say you tested older and younger adults, and you found that there's a difference between younger adults between using a cell phone and not, but not for older adults. Maybe the older adults just don't care about their cell phone; they can ignore it. Well, then that is a bit more important. Then maybe you do need a more representative sample, and you maybe even want to analyze it by demographic because the effect is there for younger adults, but not for older adults. So that's an example of where the demographics and the representativeness do actually matter, because maybe your effect is specific to one particular part of it. This does actually change the claim because now it's not really accurate to say cell phones. Again, this is just hypothetical. These are just hypothetical examples, but um, it does actually change the claim because now just telling everyone don't drive with your cell phone isn't accurate. It's only accurate to say that to younger adults. And this could kind of echo the concern with only testing undergraduates or intro psych students, is maybe what we're finding only applies to them. It doesn't apply to everyone like we think it does. Okay. So moving on, another example of convenience sampling might be, let's say we do want to look at testing older adults at something. Well, how might you recruit them? Could you use a senior center, the AARP, or certain organizations, a citizen community, newspaper ad, Meals on Wheels, assisted living, hospital, or nursing home? These would all be good examples. By the way, snowballing, this is just when you kind of distribute a study through word of mouth. So you give it to one person and then you tell them, hey, give this to your friends. They can do it as well. So it kind of snowballs. But where you're drawing your sample, so these different things all sound like good places where you could recruit elderly adults to do your study. But because again, we want to consider um, where you get your sample, how that could affect your results. That's where your results could actually change or be different depending on which of these you choose. So think about this: how would the folks differ between, say, these pink ones and these blue ones here? How might those people differ? Well, if you were to take people, there's a bunch of them I know, but say from newspaper ad or an organization, um, compared to say a nursing home or a hospital, they're probably more cognitively sound. In If you say, well, let's just pick two for example, from an organization compared to a nursing home, right? If they're able to kind of healthy enough to get up and go to these organization meetings and or the AARP or whatever meeting they're going to, um, they're probably in better shape than people you would get from a hospital or a nursing home, right, or assisted living. Okay, so that's kind of an important factor to consider, is that when you pick a different sampling method or a different place to get your sample, certain things might change with it, right? Again, people from an organization might be more cognitively intact than someone from a nursing home or hospital or assisted living. And it all just kind of depends on what you're interested in studying, as always, because if you're dealing with something, it depends on what you're dealing with, right? So let's say I wanted to look at some sort of social social study, like the influence of look at their how they relate to their friends, just as an example. Um, well, I mean, that could again be different. Recruiting someone from a newspaper compared to someone from Meals on Wheels. Maybe someone from Meals on Wheels, the reason they get their meals from there is that they don't have a lot of social support. They don't have friends or family to bring them groceries or bring them meals, whereas someone who um, is at an organization does um, or doesn't need that. So again, it's not random where you pick your sample from can influence your results because you know different those different locations can result in differences, or we shouldn't say result in, but be associated with differences in the people who do the study. That's always an important factor to consider. Um, so yeah, we kind of already covered that. Um, yeah, again, maybe it doesn't really matter. You could be running a study where, again, it's kind of the relative comparison that you care about, um, or it's some sort of experiment. But if you're looking at something more descriptive or something where you want a precise number, um, something like attitudes or whatever it might be, then it might be important to consider this where you're getting a convenience sample from. Okay, so the same thing could apply with children. So if you want to get children to do your study, um, it's always important to ask how might they be different from the general population where you recruit them from. So for example, if you were to ask, well, you have to actually have to ask their parents. We'll get to that later. Um, but if you were to get 12-year-olds from a school to do your study, how might they be different from the general population? Well, it could be lots of things, right? You could be missing out on students who are homeschooled, right? Um, maybe you're missing out on the kids who skip school, right? Could be a lot of factors there. Um, Another thing too is that parents have to actually agree to consent, not the kids, when you're running studies on children. So that could be another factor. Which parents decide to put their kid in the study? Do they differ from the general population somehow? An example of that might be, let's say the parents who do agree to put their kid in the study, are they more interested in science, right, or just kind of research in general? I mean, that could certainly be the case. Um, and if they are more interested in science, are they smarter, right? Are they more educated? Could be a lot of. Are they better in terms of SES? Could be again a lot of things that vary with where you get your sample. Okay, another kind of method you can use in terms of convenient sampling that doesn't involve undergraduates is internet research, and this is becoming more popular because you can recruit adults that are not in college. So you can use social networking sites like Facebook. You can go to forums, send emails, snowball samples again, or Amazon MTurk. That's where people get paid like a really small amount to do your study. Um, but again, all the same considerations apply, right? With convenient sampling. So let's say I was running a study on some form of exercise, and I went to a message board or a forum that discusses exercise. Well, how might that sample, the people I draw from there, be different from the general population? They probably exercise a lot more and are more interested in exercise um, if they're on a message, if they're on a forum dealing with exercise, right? So that could be a factor. It could influence the results. Just to give you a more specific example, this was actually a study um, um, by a professor here at CSU who shared this with me. Um, they did an internet study, and they found that people who did the study had this median income, or sorry, were the requirements. So they um, had like 1,000 people per each survey, and they had all 50 states. But they still found, so it should be representative in theory, right? But they found that the mean age was lower than that of the U.S. population. Um, they were pretty educated, so like 15% had graduate degrees, 1% less than 1% had a high school degree. And I don't know what the number was, but they're probably pretty educated, like a lot of college students. So again, that could be not represented. That's not very representative. It's geographically pretty representative, but not in terms of other characteristics. So again, more females tended to be have more education, have a younger age. So that's not even internet research can be non-representative. Okay, so those are all convenience samples, which, as we know by now, are non-representative. So between using college students, you know, various recruitment methods, and then also even internet studies, um, we can end up with unrepresentative samples. But here's something that can be an issue for even random sampling and all forms of research really is the issue of voluntary participation. So research, at least almost all research, requires voluntary participation. So ethical guidelines require that people don't have to do the study. Obviously, you can't walk up to people and say, "You have to do my study." They have to volunteer. Well, no, let me just clarify. There are a few exceptions to that. Like sometimes there's data out there on, you know, that's not linked to anyone's names, like kept by the federal government or whatever it might be, or medical records or something that you are allowed to use without consent. These kind of databases, but most research that doesn't involve that requires people to volunteer. So a big issue or a big concern always is that who is volunteering for the study and do they differ from the population? Okay. So let's say I send out some sort of survey um, over the internet and only like 5% of people respond that I sent it to. Well, that's kind of a bit of a red flag because that suggests that, well, obviously, only a small number of people who are actually seeing it are deciding to do it. And that begs the question, are the people that are volunteering to do it different in any way than the people than the general population and the people who didn't sign up to do the study? So in general, when you have a poor response rate, meaning again, not many people are agreeing to do your study, um, that's going to affect your representativeness usually. It might be random, but it usually isn't. Usually means that it's less representative. So, okay. So we have the idea in our head that those who volunteer for a study, especially if not many people are volunteering, could be different from from those that from the general population. So let's look at some examples of that. Um, there's a study done by Ganguly where they wanted to look. I think it was something to do with um, early signs of dementia, and they were scanning people's brains to see, what factors might predict that later in life or something along those lines. But they found that the people who did volunteer for the study were younger, tended to be male. I guess those people wanted more of them wanted a free brain scan, which is what they got for the study. They're better educated, generally healthier, and more likely to be cognitively intact and dementia free. Another example is there's a volunteer study with um, relating to health and heart health. They found that there were more females, they're more likely to white, better educated, generally healthier, more likely to have cardiovascular disease and risk factors except for smoking. So the bottom line here, kind of the takeaway is that when you ask people to do a study, those who volunteer to do the study, those who are naturally attracted to do the study might be very different from the population. And it's not random. It's not the case that just, every second person is going to agree to do the study. Those who agree to do the study might agree for a specific reason. So I'll give you a few more examples. Let's say I wanted to look at some sort of experiment to do with lifting weights and what is the best program for lifting weights. And I ran an experiment on that. Well, who would volunteer to do a weightlifting study? Would it be kind of your typical average person? Probably not, right? It's probably people who already lift weights, like lifting weights, maybe are proud of their strength, stuff like that, right? People who are experienced lifters, which is not representative of the population. You post a study about weightlifting, it's going to attract weightlifters, right? Just like this heart study. Let's say I wanted to run a study getting opinions about healthcare. I mean, who's going to volunteer to do that kind of study? Probably people who have strong opinions about healthcare, right? And it could be either way, like whatever their opinion of it is, the bottom line is they might have a strong opinion. Maybe that's not representative of a broader population that maybe feels more neutral feelings towards some healthcare issue, whatever that might be. Let's say I wanted to run a study on something to do with relationships, like romantic relationships. Well, I mean, again, people who volunteer for that study might be different than the general population. Maybe someone who hasn't been in a lot of romantic relationships is not going to want to do that study, whereas someone who has been, in good or bad relationships is going to be attracted to the study in question. The bottom line is that when you invite people to do a study, people who sign up, volunteers, might have an interest or might, and by extension, might be very different from those who don't do the study. And that could impact the results. So again, thinking about the relationship one example, if I put out a study looking at something to do with relationships, but I'm only testing people who have had many relationships or have had only good relationship or only bad ones or mix, whatever it might be, that might not be representative of most people. If I'm looking at some sort of strength training study, weightlifting study, but I'm only running it on experienced lifters, well, that could lead to a very different conclusion than I would find with the general population. So always bear that in mind too. People who volunteer for your study might be different depending on what your study is. And we could name a million examples of this, but again, thinking back to what I said about people who have an appreciation for research or science might be more likely to do your study. And maybe those people are different from the general population. Okay, so in general, the more people that do respond to your study, the more representative it is. Not always, but that's usually the case. So again, if you ask 1,000 people to do a study and only 50 volunteer, you might be dealing with some volunteer bias for sure. So there's some ways around this. Whereas if everyone is agreeing to do your study, it's going to be more representative. Chances are. So there are some remedies for this. For example, offering a small reward or incentive for participation. So if the person gets nothing for doing the study, they're obviously going to be less likely to participate than if you, say, gave them some money. Um, Reducing the stressful nature of the study can help a lot. So, again, thinking of the example of, say, weightlifting versus relationships. Well, weightlifting, if you have to be there and watch them lift weights, it's kind of a lot of pressure, right? And people who are not that strong might not want to do that study because they don't want to be watched while they're lifting weights. Where something like an online survey, an anonymous survey about previous relationships is not might not be as stressful. It might be much easier to get volunteers for. Now, sometimes you have no choice, but whenever you can, making the study less stressful is a good thing. And of course, making participation convenient. So they can fill out a quick online survey versus coming into a lab and doing something rigorous. Well, that is going to make them more, that might affect their tendency to participate, obviously. Um, so when you kind of approach people, however you approach them to do your study, making the study sound interesting is good. Being non-threatening is, of course, very helpful. Including the importance of your research is helpful, and also explaining why you need certain people to do the study can be more likely to get them to participate. Um, and just so if and with this last point here, so if they kind of feel like, well, anyone could do this study, why does it need to be me? They're less likely to participate. Whereas if you tell them we specifically need whatever you're aiming for, that might make them more likely to participate. Um, by the way, it's just another note here is it's really hard to know for sure whether your sample is representative or not, or whether there's volunteer bias. Um, it's just tough. So it's not always something you can often not something you can measure beyond response rates. So you kind of just have to think very carefully about it. A couple other things you can do is having a high status person um, make the appeal to the participants. So um, if you can find someone important or someone they trust that kind of has outreach to a lot of different people, that can help a lot. If they make a commitment, that tends to help get them to participate. So if they sign up for it, um, commit to it, rather than just on the spot making a decision, that can help. And also using a variety of strategies. So an example is if you send them an email and then also call them, or send them an email asking if they want to participate, or just to think about it and then call them a couple of weeks later when it is actually time to sign up, that can be a good strategy as well. Okay. All right, that's it for now.